The Stars Go Over the Lonely Ocean is a weird poem. so you should definitely read it aloud to yourself because got quite a musical quality to it, and you'll notice it has a refrain. So a refrain is like the part of a poem that feels like a song where it repeats, and it's almost like a chorus or something like that. And it contains this phrase, the stars go over the lonely ocean. So it's a sense of the passage of time, the universe, natural processes, but it's all disrupted by this adjective lonely. So there's a sense of isolation, of independence, of sadness. If we said the stars go over the ocean and got rid of that adjective lonely, it would feel more practical. But because of that word lonely, there's a kind of melancholic mood or atmosphere being created here. So it's a kind of sad atmosphere. And the poem is a sort of lament. So a lament is a poem form where the speaker kind of has an expression of sadness for a certain topic. Could be about love, it could be about their situation personally, it could just be generally about the state of the world. So the speaker in this poem is definitely lamenting about the sort of socio-political state of the world. It's about the whole world and the way that the world is going. So yeah, it's quite an interesting poem with quite abstract ideas that are very zoomed out, and they're kind of taking a long-term perspective, both in terms of time and also space, looking globally at how people behave and the sort of state that the world has got itself into. So yeah, there's some interesting ideas here. I recommend to just quickly pause and look through this vocab, make sure that you understand all of it, and just read the poem aloud to yourself once through so that you're prepared for this lesson. So yeah, once you've done that, we'll have a look at the story. So the speaker is wandering along the coast and up some lean ridges. So they're basically wandering along the edge of the sea on the beach. They're by themselves and they're unhappy about some distant things, some things that are far away, or maybe some things that are in their memory. It's not an immediate problem, an immediate situation. It's just a sort of general thought that they have going around in their head. And they saw in the evening that the stars go over the lonely ocean, and a black-maned wild boar turned up the earth with his snout on Malpaso Mountain. I looked up Malpaso Mountain because I was like, oh, this sounds like a place. And and I put notes about it in context. Let me just find them. It's basically, I think, an island in Spain. Yeah, it's a mountain in the Canary Islands in Spain. So it's a specific location. You might want to look up an image search of that as well to have a look at it. So, so the speaker is looking up to the mountain. There's a wild boar up there turning the earth with his nose. And he says, look, there's all this stuff in the earth to eat. Sweet roots, fat bugs, shiny beetles, acorns. The best country in Europe has fallen, but the stars go over the lonely ocean. So the boar is symbolic or representative of nature and the voice of nature and the kind of concerns and sort of urges or impulses of the natural world. So his urges and his impulses and his priorities in life, the things that he finds important, is, food, shelter, enjoying his life, having a peaceful existence. And this is contrasted with humans. So we have this idea of, the advice from the boar is to keep clear of the idiots that talk of democracy. This might be a shocking line when you first read it because we think democracy is brilliant and amazing. And generally, the opposite, which is dictatorship, is very much frowned upon by most people. But at the same time, it's sort of a criticism of being too faithful, having too much faith in political systems, to think, naively that democracy is perfect in reality. So there's a lot of difference with the way that politics works, the way that the world is run, the way that countries operate. There's always an ideal situation which seems perfect and it seems like a great idea, and then in reality, when you implement that idea, it doesn't work so well. So democracy is one of those things, according to the speaker of this poem and the poet himself, that in principle it's a great idea. In practice, it's not as democratic as we'd like it to be. It's not as equal, and there's ways to kind of skew or manipulate people into voting for things that they don't quite understand, that then alters the change, the political landscape. So this pig, he feels like democracy is stupid. But equally, the opposite, revolution, when you overthrow a country and you try and put a whole new system in place, that's, also bad. Dogs talk about that. They're drunk with talk. They're liars and believers who have false hope that the world will get better. I believe in my tusks. Long live freedom, and curse the ideologies, the political beliefs that people have, which go nowhere and lead to nothing. So very often when we get socio-political poems that are about the structure of the world and the way that society is structured, or the way that the government works, you tend to get kind of two sides, and you'll have like liberalism versus conservatism. So some people are on one side of the political debate, some people are on the other. The strange thing about this poem is the speaker and the poet himself are not on any side of the political debate. They don't agree with politics at all. So the reason is because the system is very corrupt, and all of the things that happen in politics are temporary. So revolutions are temporary. Democracy seems good, but it's corruptible. They're drunk with talk, so people talk a lot. They have really good ideas, but they don't implement those ideas. There's a false hope that the world will get better. So it's quite despondent. It's quite a negative view of reality. In a way, it's quite sad and depressive, we could say. But there's also a sense that, it's going to last for 400 or 500 years. And if you take a long-term perspective, all of these things naturally correct themselves. So there's sort of this long-term view of nature kind of going in swings and roundabouts and having cycles, which is true as well of political landscape. So if you look at England, for example, and the political parties that have been in, for a while, Conservatives will be in, and then people get sick of them, and Labour will be in, and then people get sick of them, and then Conservatives will be in. Or sometimes you get other parties as well, like the smaller parties. But that happens all the time. People get really bored of, a certain political system. They have too many criticisms of it. That gets changed or overthrown, and a new one comes into place, but the same thing happens. So he's talking about the cyclical nature of politics and the fact that it doesn't really change anything. It doesn't seem to get anywhere. And it's a lot of a waste of time and energy for people. Instead, this boar says he believes in his tusks. So he believes in his own capacity, his own personal tools. We could see that as a symbol of independence. Long live freedom. So he believes in freedom and independence. Curse the ideologies. So if there's one thing you can learn from this poem, which I would really recommend, such an important thing for life, is to learn and really understand what is an ideology and how do ideologies work, because I don't necessarily agree with all of this poem, as you can probably tell, but I do agree with this idea of ideologies are dangerous and bad. So make sure that you understand what an ideology is. There's a little bit of a definition here as well. I tried to read it and put it in detail so that you can see. So ideologies are basically a default set of beliefs that everyone else thinks, so you just think the same as them and you don't develop any of your own opinions. So it's easy to follow an ideology because it's already set out in front of you, but it's also dangerous because it stops you from being your own individual person. You just follow whatever everyone else says you should be. So if you're an atheist, that's a type of ideology, or if you're a Christian, also an ideology. So it doesn't matter what the belief system is, you just want to make sure that the ideas of that are personal to you, and you don't necessarily have to agree with all of them in order to call yourself that thing. So it's a very short description of ideology. I recommend reading more about it. But yeah, it's a set of beliefs that you kind of download and adopt and then reflect back. And if you just believe what you were told to believe without having your own opinions, it can be quite dangerous. So the poet and the speaker are both anti-ideological. They're against the idea of ideology, and I agree with that element of it, which is why I'm just giving you this warning in the middle of my poetry analysis. So whether you're political or not, the idea of, people should be free, ideologies are not free, is quite an interesting one to get kind of stuck into. So there's a sense that this person, this Bohr, is independent. He's kind of removed himself from any political system because he can't trust any of it, and he feels like it's just cyclical anyway, it's just going to repeat. So there's quite a lot of ideas in the speaker and the voice. The main thing is that there's two speakers here. So there's the speaker who's the human walking along the shore, and then the Bohr himself. So the speaker walking along the shore, he's just there to create something called a frame narrative. So he starts off the poem and he's a human. He encounters an animal who sort of represents the voice of nature. And then the animal gives him this kind of earthly, natural wisdom that is really kind of not very human at all. Humans usually are really caught up with society and their social structures and their political structures. And the Bohr is saying, remove yourself from all of that. You're better off to believe in yourself and your own personal power and your own freedom. Don't follow politics and get too involved, because it won't get you anywhere. So he's disdainful, the Bohr, of humans and their political world. He focuses instead on the laws of nature, natural ways of existing in harmony with the land around him, living a simplistic way of life that kind of avoids the sort of games you have to play in a city to keep up with society. Instead, living a rural existence. So it's an allegorical poem. It's directly criticizing, I'm trying to highlight this, but it goes a bit weird, directly criticizing modern politics and the problems with modern society. It was written at a slightly different time from now, so let me just find you. Where did my context page go? There. So it was written not necessarily in exactly the same political climate as we're in now, but it's very, very much a comment on the modern world which we're still experiencing at the moment. So Robinson Jeffers is an American poet, and he really wanted to get back to nature as an individual. He really wasn't kind of into the idea of society and humans living separate from nature, and he thought the human race was kind of getting worse over time because it was getting less and less in touch with nature and our natural origins as humans. He also started to kind of harbor atheistic beliefs, so he thought that God possibly did exist, but God had abandoned us because we sort of abandoned nature and didn't care for nature, and that was kind of disrespectful directly to God. So there's this feeling that we've been abandoned by God, we've lost touch with nature, we're just sort of stuck in our own little cycles, which are very human focused and egocentric. So in a way, he's sort of like an environmentalist or political activist that campaigns against climate change and those types of things. You can kind of compare him to a modern day person who's like that. But he's also very much against big society, so against sort of cities and nations and governments and that kind of thing. He thinks that people should return to a more simplistic way of life. So he has this really interesting philosophy called inhumanism that I recommend looking into a bit more. And yeah, there's this really interesting little quote here. It might take you a while to read about inhumanism and kind of pick this apart a little bit, but it's quite an interesting critical quote if you're quite energized by the ideas of this poem and it's making you think. You shouldn't necessarily agree with this poem, so a lot of you reading this or listening to this are going to be very offended by Jeffers, because a lot of people nowadays, and generally are political, they have very strong political beliefs and they feel like that makes them a good person, or that's an important aspect of society. So it's definitely not one of those poems where you have to agree with the guy. He's quite an unusual perspective that he provides. I semi-agree with him. I think I'm sort of in the middle, personally. But most people, I think, would be really confused by the idea that we should not care about politics, never have any opinions on politics, and that all politicians are pointless. So yeah, he's quite extreme and absolute with that. But he has this philosophy called inhumanism, and yeah, you can read a little bit more about that and what that means and how that connects to the poem if you're kind of interested in analysing it a little bit deeper. So these attitudes might help sort of solidify the main ideas of the poem, if I can find them. These are quite new documents I'm working with, so I'm just getting used to the format of them. There we go. Yeah, so the Boer is anti-ideological. He doesn't like politics, but he also doesn't like anything where just groups of people believe it because they all believe the same thing. If it seems like a solution to the world's problems, it's probably not. That's probably too good to be true. He says, I believe in my tusks, a symbol of his own power and strength. If you did want to put Jeffers into a political category, the closest would be to call him a libertarian. So yeah, read up about libertarianism. It's a different alternative to being liberal or conservative. So yeah, libertarian's a slightly different political stance that you can research as well. So there's a sense that politics is not worth our time and attention in the poem. Also a sense that humans are cruel to neglect and mistreat nature, and we should really reclaim that. And something about our obsession with politics and big society in Jeffers' mind is connected to this idea that we're no longer environmentally conscious. So he connects those two beliefs together. You may agree with him, you may not. There's also this sense, which I don't agree with personally, but a lot of writers do have this opinion that they're just like, I'm going to run away. But isolation from society is a way to get back to nature for a human person to reground themselves in the natural world, and the best way to cope with all of those problems. So if you've ever had that day where you're just reading the news and you're like, oh, there's too many horrible things going on in the world, why is it so bad? Jeffers felt like this, and his solution was to go live a more quiet, peaceful, natural life away from those really big picture, social issues that we constantly are aware of and are totally powerless to change. There's also a sense that history repeats itself. It moves in cycles. We always cycle through periods of stability and goodness and abundance, and then periods of difficulty and stress and war and chaos. So there'll always be times in our lives, and even on a longer term perspective, the Boer talks about 400 or 500 years, there's going to be ups and downs, certain trends and fashions and ebbs and flows in the political landscape. So as an individual human, you don't really have any capacity to change that. It naturally changes over time. So I agree with this point, actually, to do with Jeffers personally. I think that if you read a lot into the history of politics and the different political movements over the last 600 years or 1,000 years, gives you a lot more of an interesting and important perspective on politics, rather than just reading about the issues that have happened in the last 20 years or so. So yeah, a long-term perspective on politics is, in my opinion, a really useful thing. I don't necessarily agree with this one here, the idea that politics is not worth our time. So the exercises on this one, they're quite important, I think, because I really think that for you to write well about this poem and to analyze this poem well, you need to develop your own thoughts, and they might be the same as Jeffers, they might be totally different, or they might be like me and somewhere in the middle. So I recommend just trying these 3 exercises, because they're going to help you develop and kind of refine your own opinions on this. They're really big topics, so it might take you a while to read about them, but I think they're sort of the kinds of things that it's worth having an opinion on. It's worth coming to your own conclusions about and reading about. So yeah, you might need to go on a bit of a research rabbit hole with this one. So yeah, hopefully you're feeling more confident with this poem. You understand these ideas a little bit more. Do make sure that you understand these words in detail, like democracy, ideology, politics, those types of things. And yeah, hopefully you enjoy the poem, find it a little bit thought-provoking, maybe even a little bit offensive. Sometimes it's good to be offended, because we can find our own beliefs more strongly if something challenges them. So yeah, if this poem's challenging for you and you really get offended by it, that's not necessarily a bad thing either. So hopefully you're not too offended, and you found it kind of energizing and interesting. And if you want any more resources, go to www.scribbly.com. Thank you for listening and taking part in this lesson, and I'll see you guys soon.